Good afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome you to the third and final session for this semester in the Department of Philosophy's webinar series, Practical Philosophy. The goal of this webinar series is for members of our faculty to discuss pressing moral and political issues that give rise to significant philosophical questions. I'm delighted to introduce my friend and colleague, Professor Tristram McPherson, who will be our speaker today. Tristram is a professor in the Department of Philosophy with affiliations to the Center for Ethics and Human Values and the Sustainability Institute here at OSU. Prior to coming to Ohio State in 2015, Tristram completed a doctorate in philosophy at Princeton University and then held appointments at the University of Minnesota and Virginia Tech. He's published extensively on topics in ethics, epistemology, and metaethics. Today, Tristram will give a presentation entitled How to Think About Consumers' Ethical Relationships to Large-Scale Wrongs. So Tristram's going to speak for about 25 minutes, and then we're going to have about half an hour for questions, and Tristram will address your questions. So keep in mind that if you have any questions during the talk, please add them to the Q&A box, and that way Tristram can address them during the question and answer period. Okay, over to you, Tristram.
All right, thank you so much, Richard. So when I was thinking about this talk, one of the things I was thinking about is, a very natural question for people to ask, what do I, as a philosopher, have to contribute to our thinking about ethics? And it's not that I have like some special, ethical fact detector that other people don't have. I rather think that philosophers have developed a bunch of tools for thinking in a more sophisticated way about ethical problems. And so what I'm going to do today, rather than kind of, advertise the view that I think is the most promising view, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about a problem, and I'm going to talk about a range of views that I think are rich views for thinking about this problem, and think about something about the virtues and vices of those views. So that's the plan. Very often my initial inclination is to think in very abstract terms, so I thought I would combat that a little bit by starting with a focal example. So there's a wonderful article about a month ago in the New York Times about the labor exploitation in the sugar industry in the Indian state of Maharashtra. And I won't go into a ton of detail about this, but you see a whole collection of pretty clearly systematically wrongful and exploitative practices. You see child labor, you see lots of something like sort of debt-based exploitation of workers by their employers. You see lots of specifically gender-based problems. One of the remarkable and horrifying things emphasized in this article is that roughly 1 in 5 of the women working in this area have had hysterectomies because it's seen as a strategy to make it more possible for them to work more, basically. So this particular case is going to be my focal example. It's tied to us as consumers, you might think, because this sugar goes into our Coke and Pepsi products, right? And so when we buy Coke and Pepsi products, we're buying products that are produced in part in virtue of these wrongful practices. So this is going to be the focal example I'm mostly going to work on, but I'm also think the basic kind of issues that I'm going to raise are going to arise for thinking about the factory farming of non-human animals, or about the kind of broad systemic challenges posed by something like climate change. All right, so that's the kind of focal example I want to talk about. Now, when you think about these kinds of examples, I think it's fair to say that consumers seem involved. So in my title slide, I used this meme image, which is a parody of a famous restaurant advertising campaign. And the thought is that the message these chickens are trying to give us seems sort of sensible, because the thought is if they're successful in convincing consumers to eat more kale, then things might go better for them as chickens. That's kind of the thought. But consumers are not involved in a particularly ethically straightforward way. And to make this kind of contrast, I want to think about a kind of gruesome example, first of all. Imagine, I wanted to use a real life example in my webinar, and I brought like a cute little kitten in a cage and a can of gasoline and some matches, and I poured the gasoline over the cat and set it on fire. So that would be this like horrible suffering that the cat would experience. And when you ask the question, like, how is Tristram involved in this horrible suffering? The answer is easy. I directly brought that horrible suffering about through my actions. On the other hand, it's much less clear if I open up a can of cola what the relationship between my action there and the exploitation of the woman on the sugar plantation is. It's not as if I'm standing there behind her, forcing her in exploitative contexts to harvest the sugarcane. So we want to understand what that relationship is, and specifically, we want to think about what might be a description of that relationship that is illuminating for thinking about what our ethical responsibilities as consumers are. So that's the general plan of the talk. When we think about wrongs like factory farming in the upper right there, like the sorts of wrongs that are associated with climate change, see the ubiquitous forest fires illustrated in the lower part of the slide, or the kind of labor exploitation being represented in the upper left, we can ask, what are the illuminating ethically significant descriptions of individual consumers' relationships to these wrongs? And I think that philosophers have made a lot of progress in thinking about this question over approximately the past 40 years. And my aim is to explore 4 important models from contemporary ethics that I think can help us to think better about this question. So that's the plan. All right, so on to the first model. So here's a very natural thought. The very natural thought is like, look, here I am. I buy the cola, I exchange my money to someone, and somehow in doing so, I make a difference to how much labor exploitation there is in one of these sugar plantations in Maharashtra. Okay. Now that, if you could sort of spell that out, that would seem like an ethically significant kind of relationship. After all, if you're making it the case, if you make a difference to how much of such exploitation there is, you make it the case that there's more such exploitation, that seems like a pretty seriously problematic thing to do, given that the exploitation is wrong. But why think that might be the case? Well, you might tell a story roughly like the following. You might think, this is a situation which is being structured by broadly a market economy. And in general, efficient markets are responsive to consumer demand. So as people are prepared to exchange money for cans of Coke, that creates a sort of signal that at a given price point, here's how much Coke can be sold, which then gives producers incentives to produce those products, which gives them incentives to pay for the sugar, which is produced in these exploitative ways, et cetera, et cetera. And so the thought might be, look, because efficient markets are responsive to consumer demand, as a consumer, of course, the amount of demand that you're changing when you buy a Coke or don't buy a Coke is very small, but maybe you have a small chance of making a difference. But overall, the thought is you can expect to make a difference by doing so. And if that's right, then we can kind of directly explain why it is that I would have a reason not to buy a can of Coke. Namely, if buying a can of Coke is going to make it the case, or I can expect that it's going to make it the case, that there's going to be a little bit more wrongful exploitation, say, of child laborers, then that would seem to be a pretty good reason to refrain from doing that. Okay, so that's the first model, and that model has gotten a lot of attention in contemporary ethics. Now, I think there are 2 fundamental kinds of worries about this exploitation. This explanation. And the first, which has been the topic of probably dozens of papers at this point, is the question of whether it's really plausible that I can expect in buying my can of Coke to make a difference to how much wrongful exploitation of labor there actually is. The thought might be, there's just markets are responsive to information, but they're not that responsive. There's too much noise, there's too much inefficiency, you might think. And so if that's the case, then this model is not going to predict that we have reasons. It's not going to give us an explanation of why we have reasons to refrain from buying a can of Coke. Maybe it's going to entail that we don't, because we can't expect to make a difference. Okay. And I think this raises a really important second question, which is a question I find especially gripping. Suppose that I have reason to believe that I don't make a difference. My buying the can of Coke is not, in fact, going to cause it to be the case or make a difference to how much exploitation there is. Does that mean I'm off the hook? And my suspicion is that no, that doesn't mean that I'm off the hook. That doesn't mean that I have no reason to refrain from the relevant kind of behavior. And I want to talk about three kinds of models that might help to explain that thought. So the first kind of model shifts focus from my direct individual causal role and thinks about the fact that I'm a member of a group. So here's a slogan for the second model. What is the ethically significant about my role when I buy the can of cola? Well, as a consumer buying that can of cola, I'm a member of a group, the group of cola consumers, and that group uncontroversially brings about the bad outcome, right? If no one was buying cola, then there would be no demand for the relevant cola products, and so the relevant cola products would not be exploiting these, the relevant companies would not be exploiting these workers in order to get sugar to make Coke products. Okay, so that's the kind of thought, is that although individually I might make a difference, I'm part of a group. We together as consumers do make a difference. And what I have a reason to do is to avoid being part of a group that brings about this bad outcome. Okay, so that's the second kind of proposal about how to explain ethically what's going on in this case. All right, and so here's again the motivating thought. The cola consumers together bring it about that the wrongful exploitation of women and children persists. Given that fact, you have compelling reasons not to be part of such a group, even if you individually make no difference to how much exploitation there is. You should just not be part of a whole that's doing a wrongful thing. Okay. So again, I think that's a pretty compelling sounding thought. But it's a compelling sounding thought which faces an important kind of objection. And I'm going to introduce the objection via a kind of silly sounding thought experiment. And this is something that philosophers often appeal to thought experiments that are very abstract and very unrealistic. And I think the way to think about what we're doing when we do that is we're trying to come up with examples that isolate features of situations that we want to focus our attention on, so we can think clearly about those features. So that's what I'm going to do here via my pretty ridiculous thought experiment. So imagine that there is a button, a shiny button. Imagine that the button has this amazing property. If 1 million people press that button, then 1 billion animals will be saved from being tortured. That's an amazing button. Seems like that's a reason to press the button, maybe. And we can say more. Secondly, success. The 1 million or so people are going to press that button. We're going to get enough people to cross that threshold, right? And the idea with the button is if fewer than 1 million people press it, no saving animals. But if at least 1 million people press it, then you get the animals being saved. And now notice, if you press the button too, you're going to be part of the group of people that together press that button, together brought it about that 1 billion animals were saved from being tortured. You might think, hooray! Wonderful, excellent reason to press the button. But now, let's add a little bit more detail. Let's make clear, let's stipulate that if you press the button, 1 million other people are already going to press the button whether you press the button or not. And so if you press the button, that's not going to make any difference to how many animals are saved. And suppose that if you don't spend your time pressing the button, you can instead go off somewhere else and save 1 animal. You might think, when you're thinking about what you should do, maybe you should, it doesn't matter whether you can be a part of this group that saves 1 billion animals. You're not going to be a part of the group that makes any difference, you might think. And so you might think, if you're given this kind of choice, if you know all this, you should not press the button, but instead go off and save the one animal. And that, you might think, casts doubt on this group-based explanation. Okay. Now, so far, we've looked at explanations that have been about making a difference, whether you as an individual make a difference or whether you're part of a group that makes a difference. And what I want to consider next is a picture where making a difference is not seemingly the crucial thing. So I want to give you a third kind of model, which says maybe we were off down the wrong track entirely when we're thinking about making a difference in this way. So imagine it's like this. There's a bank robbery. And you yourself are not one of the bank robbers, but man, that is a fine 1970s style muscle car, and you are going to drive it to enable the bank robbers to get away. Okay? So there you are driving the getaway car. Here's something that seems true. You didn't rob the bank. You are not a bank robber. But if you drive the getaway car, you seem in some sense involved in an ethically relevant way to the bank robbery. And if we assume that the bank robbery was wrong, it seems like you inherit some moral criticizability. It seems like what you do is wrong if you drive the getaway car. Okay. And so I think there's a nice model here. And that is that the people who actually rob the bank are the principal wrongful actors. There's a kind of wrongful act, bank robbing, and the people who actually rob the bank, those are the principal wrongful actors. If you drive the getaway car, you're not one of those people. But you are their accomplice, and that is, you are playing a crucial role in their plan. If nobody drives a getaway car, they're not successfully going to rob the bank and get away. And so they're not going to even attempt to rob the bank, you might imagine, under those circumstances. And so driving the getaway car is a crucial part of this wrongful plan. Somebody plays that role. They are playing a crucial part in this wrongful plan. Although, of course, there's nothing intrinsically wrong about driving a car. There is something wrong about playing a part, you might think, as an accomplice in this wrongful plan. And so you might think that this is a tempting model for sweatshops or the kind of labor exploitation that we were talking about in the sugar mill example. So here's the thought. The person or the corporation that runs the exploitative sugar plantation, they're the principal wrongful actor in this case. And when you buy their products, you yourself are not one of the principal actors, but you're an accomplice to their wrongdoing. And why do I say this? Well, the people who are exploiting the labor of these workers aren't doing it for fun or because they're sadists. They're doing it to make money. And in order to make money exploiting these workers, they need people to buy the products that are being created using that wrongful labor. So by being a consumer, by buying the can of cola, you are basically playing an essential role in their wrongful plan, in the same way that the getaway car driver is playing an essential role in the wrongful plan of the bank robbers. And so you might think, now we have a nice explanation of why it is that it's wrong for you to drink the can of Coke, or at least you have a strong reason to avoid drinking the Coke in this case. Namely, by doing so, you're an accomplice in this sort of uncontroversial, direct wrongful behavior of the people who are exploiting the laborers. Okay, so that's the third model, which I'll call the complicity model. So, but again, I think things are not perfectly simple. So again, let's come back to our case. Here's the kind of challenge to the complicity model. And it's a challenge to how neatly that phenomenon that we're trying to theorize as ethicists, how neatly it analogizes to the case of the bank robbery. And here's a nice kind of way of thinking about the challenge. What explains the prevalence of plantation or sweatshop exploitation? And you might think, in the case of a bank robbery, what explains the fact that bank robbery is happening is that the bank robbers, they have this wrongful plan. And so it's something about their bad character that sort of explains why this bank robbery is going to happen. And so you might think if things were perfectly parallel, we could just kind of lay the responsibility, the primary responsibility for the plantation exploitation at the feet of malevolent owners of the plantations. But you might think this is actually pretty implausible because these plantations are part of a global market, and a global market that operates within a specific kind of economic and legal environment. And so you can imagine, suppose that you were somebody who owned one of these sugar plantations, and you wanted to refuse to employ child laborers, you wanted to treat your employees with dignity, prevent them from being basically in debt slavery to you. You wanted to ensure that they got a decent wage for their work, etc. We can kind of predict that if you did this, the sugar that you produce is going to cost more to produce than the sugar that's produced exploitatively. After all, the people who are exploiting laborers are doing it because they can get more of the goodies that they're trying to profit from producing and selling at a lower price from their laborers. And what that means is that if you tried to be a non-exploitative sugar plantation owner in this context, you would probably go out of business. And so you might think that the economic and political environment actually sort of programs for exploitative working conditions. That is, if those exploitative working conditions are legally and economically feasible, then anyone who tries to not do that is going to go out of business. So here's now a kind of challenge. If malevolent owners are not the root of the problem, then it might seem that the complicity story is an implausible kind of explanatory diagnosis. And if it's an implausible explanatory diagnosis, you might think it's an implausible story about what the nature of my important ethical relationship as a consumer to the principal wrong actions is. The idea of anti-complicity, you might think in these cases, is not targeting the root of the problem. And this takes us kind of naturally to the fourth kind of account that I want to consider. And this is a kind of account that you might call a social structural analysis. And here's the core idea of this kind of account. You might think the most illuminating, the sort of explanation of the sorts of large-scale wrongs that we've been considering that is best at actually explaining how these phenomena persist involves the idea of unjust social structures. That is, patterns of social relations that on the one hand are unjust, and on the other hand, give individuals who are parts of those structures incentives to act in ways that reproduce those structures, right? So I talked a little bit about being the plantation owner and how economic incentives give the plantation owners incentives to exploit their workers. But of course, the workers themselves also have incentives to be exploited. After all, they have limited other options in terms of the labor market. They have like gone into debt, many of them, to their employers, and so they face horrible consequences if they fail to continue working, etc. And so everyone in these structures has these incentives to act in ways that continue to reproduce these structures. Okay. So suppose that's the right analysis of what's going on in at least many of these cases of these large-scale wrongs, where we're wondering about the roles of consumers. Well, you might think that if that's right, ethical action should not be understood as sort of responding to the wrongful behavior of particular actors, right? In the complicity model, the idea is it's the wrongful behavior of the principal actor that I'm refusing to be an accomplice to, right? But you might think if this is right instead, ethical action should ideally target the unjust structures themselves. If we're going to bring it about collectively, that there is less labor exploitation in the world, we're going to have to change those incentive structures, or else they're just going to keep reproducing themselves, right? And so this might suggest a kind of proposal like the following. The ethically illuminating way of understanding the relationship of consumers to large-scale wrongs is that consumers are related to those wrongs by being part of the unjust structures that explain the existence of those wrongs. And because of this fact, consumers each have reasons to organize with others to change those structures so that they're no longer part of an unjust structure. And so that when people make decisions that they have incentives to make, they're not going to be wronging each other or reproducing unjust structures. Okay, so that's a final kind of proposal for a way of thinking about structure. But wait, we're not out of the woods yet, because you might think we've now come back full circle. Here I am proposing, right? Let's go back to the previous slide, that consumers have reasons to organize with others to change these unjust structures. Great, you might think. But you might think, will my organizing with others make a difference? Pretty tough. And suppose that we don't. Suppose I think probably not. Suppose that I think my particular contribution is very unlikely to change any unjust structure. And if I think that, here's this alarming possibility. Are we back with the shiny button? And if we're back with the shiny button, then it really seemed like in that case, man, I had a choice if I was going to press the button, or I could do something that was actually going to make a difference. Maybe I should be doing something that actually makes a difference. And so you might worry that even if we've got an illuminating explanation of why these unjust structures persist, we don't yet have something which explains what we as individuals should be doing, because we might not actually, as individuals, be able to make a difference in a positive way to changing those structures. That's a kind of dark thought. All right. There's a lot to be said here, as I want to emphasize at every stage of this talk, I have been moving extremely quickly through some extremely complicated terrain. But I just want to hint in closing at the start of a reply to this challenge. So one thing to say about this challenge that I think is really important and deeply illuminating, and this is one of these things that I think sometimes even really excellent inquirers and philosophers thinking about these issues start to lose a grip on a little bit, is that sometimes ethical explanation is not just about making a difference. So come back to the case of the bank robbery. And imagine again that I drove the getaway car. And that afterwards you're talking to me about what I did. And you say, Tristram, you admit that the bank robbery was wrong. And I'm like, oh yeah, no one should rob banks. And you're like, but you drove the getaway car. You're an accomplice to this wrongful action. And I'm like, yeah, but look, I didn't make any difference to whether the bank robbery was going to happen. In fact, there were many people who were willing to drive that getaway car. If I hadn't driven the getaway car, somebody else, pretty good getaway car driver, would have driven it, and no difference would have been made. It seems to me that the right reaction to this is to think that I've betrayed a kind of profound moral incapacity, if I think that's a sufficient response in this case. You don't get off the hook for driving a getaway car for a wrongful bank robbery by pointing out that if you hadn't done it, somebody else would, right? And what this shows is that the relationship of being an accomplice to a wrongful act is not fundamentally a relationship that's just about making a difference. It can be wrong to be an accomplice to a wrongful act, even if you know you're not going to make a difference. And so that should allow us to think that even if, in the case of these complicity style explanations or the social structural style explanations, we're not confident that we're going to make a difference, it may be that nonetheless we have substantial reasons to avoid performing certain behaviors or to positively engage in certain behaviors like organizing to try to change some of these social structures. Okay. Now I want to step back. So far, I've talked about 4 different explanatory models that might illuminate our thinking about my relationship as a consumer, or your relationship, to, for example, the labor exploitation of a sugar plantation worker, right? I've talked about the idea that I might individually make a difference to how much such exploitation there is. I've talked about the idea that, well, if I, for example, buy a 6-pack of cola, I might be a member of a group that together is making a difference to how much such labor exploitation there is. I've talked about the idea that in buying the 6-pack of cola, I might be complicit with the people who are directly wronging those laborers. And I've talked about the idea that as a consumer, I might be caught up in a social structure, which is kind of reproducing that wrongful behavior, such that I have reasons to be trying to change those social structures. Now, I want to emphasize that none of the explanatory resources I've explored today are uncontroversial. And there's also much more to be said in their defense in each of the 4 cases than I've offered you today. So this is really just the beginning of a conversation about each of these 4 strategies. But my hope is that rather than starting out where some of you may have been at the beginning of the conversation, of thinking like, look, the case of drinking the can of Coke seems different from the case of setting the cat on fire. How do we think about that? We now have some rich explanatory structures that we can then carefully interrogate to think about what might be the individual consumer's ethically significant role. So my aim today has not been to tell you what to think about that role, but is to give you some structures that you can use to think better for yourself about that role. And I hope in that respect, I've been helpful. Thank you all very much. I want to conclude by just saying the following thing. One of the things I think that's wonderful about this literature is that if you are interested in this topic, some of the philosophy that's been written in this literature is really interesting and, for philosophy, comparatively accessible. Many of these papers you can pick up and understand them without having a ton of philosophy background and get a lot out of thinking about them. And so I've just listed a bunch of my favorite papers. I haven't name-checked people during the talk, but most of the ideas that I've talked about today come from some of these papers. And I should say there's one exception to my claim about how accessible these papers are. I've listed one paper at the bottom by me that actually has my preferred way of thinking about this topic. But I have been told that that paper is punishingly difficult. So it's not, of all these papers, this is probably the one that is not super friendly to the beginning reader. And with that, I will turn things over to Richard, who can moderate some Q&A.
Great, thank you, Tristram. That's super interesting. Okay, so I'll start asking some questions from the list of that's been submitted. If you have thoughts, questions along the way, feel free to add them to the Q&A box. So I'll start with a question from Nelson Pole, and this is a question, I guess, which concerns the extent to which you can be morally responsible for things that you're unaware of. So the question runs as follows: isn't it plausible that every product has some associated exploitation or harm about which I do not even know, even if I read the New York Times? How can I be responsible in any way for what I am not aware of? I cannot possibly be successful at knowing everything.
Okay, so that's a wonderful question. So I want to I think there's actually a couple of different questions there that I want to think about separately. So the first question that I want to think about there is the question about whether it's plausible that every product has some associated exploitation or harm associated with it. And one of the things I want to say about this is going to depend, where you come down on this question is going to depend a lot, I think, on some of your background views about various kinds of substantive ethical questions, right? Whether you think that factory farming is problematic, which I certainly do, is going to depend on how you think about the ethical status of non-human animals, which which labor practices you think are exploitative is going to depend in part what you think an ethically acceptable baseline in employment is, et cetera. And so I think like there's a way of thinking about some of those background topics where the range of cases where this issue arises is relatively limited. I think there's also a way of thinking about those background issues where, as the questioner suggests, these issues are kind of everywhere. So I think that some of these answers tell you different things depending on which of those answers, depending on which of those hypotheses you think is correct. Okay, so for example, if you're thinking about the group-based efficacy story, that like the thing that explains what my reasons are to avoid, say, drinking the can of cola, are that I'm a member of a group that together is playing this role in this problematic outcome. But you also think that like every time anyone engages in any economic behavior, that's true of them. Then I think it's plausible to me that you don't get very much practical guidance out of this theory, right? Like, yes, every time I do something, I'm a member of a group of people that is, in some sense, a group that that engages in, say, exploitative behavior. And you might think, well, then there's just like nothing to choose between options. Now, I do think like that's a very dark possibility, and if that's a dark possibility, I do think it sort of puts pressure to think in terms of like, maybe if that's the case, it doesn't tell you like whether or not to drink the Coke, because drinking the Coke is no different from drinking anything else at that point. But maybe it does put a lot of pressure on you to think that things are so profoundly unjust that there really are strong pressure on you to start thinking in terms of changing some of those structures. Okay. So on the other hand, if you think, no, there's a relatively compact set of these cases, then on the kind of group-based picture, then you might think, no. Then what that tells you is that in those cases, you have reasons not to engage in these behaviors, and then the other cases are kind of other things being equal, okay. By contrast, think about the kind of individual efficacy answer, the sort of story that says, I, as an individual, make some difference to the wrongful outcomes, or can expect to make some difference to the wrongful outcomes through my behavior. There, I think the revelation that this stuff is everywhere, if indeed this kind of wrongful behavior is everywhere, I don't think that has a similar upshot that like you kind of throw up your hands, because then we can start trying to investigate what are the cases where you're going to tend to make more of a difference? What are the cases in which you're going to tend to make less of a difference? And we can then sort of sensibly ask those questions. And it's very plausible in that kind of picture that you have stronger reasons to refrain when the expected difference you're going to make is going to be greater, right? So that's just about that first part of the question. And so the upshot of that is I really think some views are going to say, yeah, once you get that situation, it's very hard to give any particular ethical guidance, and other views are going to have more that they can say. Okay, the second part of the question, which I think is fascinating, right? There's this core idea: how can I be responsible in any way for what I'm not aware of? Okay. Here, I think there's a couple of ways to go. I think some people will think there are things that everyone is responsible to be aware of. If you're not paying attention to certain information about your environment, you are culpable for your ignorance about those things. So you might think, for example, that if you are not aware of like the racism that is endemic in our current political, economic, and cultural context, like you're just not paying enough attention to your world, and you are culpable for that ignorance, right? You might think there are other kinds of things. One of the things that's true about many of these cases is that there are actors with incentives to make it hard for you to get the relevant information, right? So in the case of the factory farming of non-human animals, for example, there are many states in the United States that have laws that make it hard for people to get information about what the conditions are actually like inside those factory farms, right? And so in some of those cases, those kinds of institutional barriers are going to, I think, be exculpating. It's going to be the case. Those are cases where you're not aware, and plausibly it's not your fault that you're not aware. It's like literally the fault of like other major social actors who are putting up substantial impediments to your awareness. Okay. And so my inclination in response to the second part of this question, which I think is fascinating, is to think we can divide cases between cases where we do intuitively think that you have some responsibility and cases where we think, no, this ignorance is somebody else's fault. Somebody else has systematically made it hard for me to access some information. And that kind of fact can be exculpating. It can excuse you for your ignorance of some fact that would otherwise be morally very, very important.
Okay, thank you, Tristram. This is a question from Sung Soo Lee, and he asks, it particularly concerns the complicity model. Would the complicity model imply that when the plantation owner exploits labor just for fun, with no plan for money, the consumer would be off the hook?
That's an awesome question. So I want to talk about that. And I want to start out by thinking about the bank robbery case. You can imagine a bank robber who has the following thought. I'm going to rob a bank and I don't care whether I'm going to get caught. But you know what I really like to do after a good bank robbery? Go on a joyride, maybe with a police chase involved. I've watched a lot of the wrong kinds of movies and I'm really excited, right? And so in that case, if you're driving the getaway car, I think that there's a natural way of saying in that kind of case, you're not actually complicit with the bank robbery. Because the bank robbery would happen with or without you're driving the getaway car. You're just doing this thing that you're like, it maybe is a little shabby that you're hanging out with this person who just robbed a bank. But that's not the same as being like complicit with their bank robbing, right? So I think that in what this kind of shows is that if that's what's going on in these kinds of cases, then if there's something wrongful about say, drinking the can of Coke that's being produced by someone who likes to exploit their laborers and sells Coke, but they don't actually care about making money. They like sell the Coke at a loss. They just get a kick out of exploiting laborers and selling Coke products. I think that, again, the way to think about this case is actually very similar to the way to think about driving the joyride getaway car with the bank robber who doesn't care about getting caught. Like, there's probably something, and some philosophers will talk about a kind of idea of moral taint. Like, by being willing to sort of associate with the person who's the wrongful actor, you are thereby like, you're somehow getting infected with the wrongfulness. But it doesn't look to me like what's going on in that case can be sort of explained in the complicity way. Maybe I'll say one other thing about this question, which is something which I probably haven't sufficiently emphasized during the talk. I talked about these 4 explanatory models, and I also raised challenges to each of the 4 explanatory models. And one way this literature often goes is that you get this feeling like we're looking for the one ring, right? The one explanatory relation that's going to explain what our reasons are. And sometimes it seems like that's a reasonable strategy because it's so hard to find even one that would work, right? But one serious possibility to take into account is that maybe there are multiple things that are wrong. Maybe there are multiple problems with your relationship to the plantation exploitation, for example. And then if you change certain features of the situation, some of them persist, right? Maybe you're still part of a group, et cetera, but other ones get lost. Maybe you're no longer complicit. And so I don't think it's an objection to a complicity explanation that we can drum up versions of the case where we're still kind of not very happy where that relationship is no longer holds, provided if we think where that relationship does hold, it does some of the explanatory work. So that's a great question, but I think that's how I'm inclined to answer it very briefly.
Thanks. So here's a question from Farrell Brody, and I think they're particularly concerned with the social structural explanations at the end and what might be required if you followed out the implications of the sort of challenge that you raised to this sort of approach. So the question runs as follows: if the only way to solve the problem is by changing the social structure, doesn't that require a change like socialism?
Fantastic. So one of the things that I said towards the end of the talk was well, actually, as a response to the first question, was it's actually going to depend on part of what you think about the background story, right? So one of the things I think that you might think is if, as with the hypothesis that we were talking about in response to that first question, you think this problem isn't just a problem in Maharashtra, this is a problem like everywhere where you see a consumer product, you can find labor exploitation. And if you think that's non-accidental, because wherever you have capitalistic relations, you're going to just get labor exploitation. If you think there's some like very sort of like strong, some sort of like almost like economic law of nature like that, then I think that would strongly suggest that the kind of transformation you need to have in order to avoid that kind of outcome would be a fundamental change to the economic structure. Maybe socialism, maybe something else, right? On the other hand, I think there's a lot of room to have a view that says, here are lots of recognizably capitalistic economic relations that are not exploitative. Here are ones that are. The ones that are problematic, we need to organize our politics and our economics such that those ones get resolved, right? There's a sort of standard kind of literature where people talk about externalities of various kinds and market failures of various kinds. And you might think the cases where we see problems are cases where, as it were, the problem isn't like with capitalism per se, but like capitalism hasn't been integrated in the right way with a kind of political and legal framework. So that's a huge question. I have to say I have views about that question, but I also think that question is to some extent outside of my area of expertise. Like, I don't fully understand how economic mechanisms work, and that's really what's at stake, I think, in trying to answer that question. But I just want to flag, again, for the purpose of thinking about enabling people with different views to think critically about these questions, that whether you answer the question in the way that Farrell was suggesting is going to depend on your background views about these kinds of questions.
Thank you. So this question is from Burj Aberol. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. You mentioned that producing cola without exploitation would mean the business would go bankrupt because of the economic and political structure within which we live. When we think of ethical consumption, however, sometimes consumers with economic privileges are willing to pay more for products that are supposedly produced without the exploitation of people or nature. We can think about this as the sharing of moral responsibility between consumers and producers within the current structures, assuming, of course, that the producers are honest. Where would this phenomenon fit within the models that you laid out?
Okay, this is a fantastic question. And of course, there are lots of mechanisms that are sort of supposed to sort of do this. If you think about the idea of fair trade certification, the idea precisely is that if you buy some fair trade chocolate, for example, you should have reason to believe that the chocolate you're buying hasn't been produced using child slave labor, as much of the chocolate that is commercially available is, right? And so you might think, hey, look, in that kind of case, what we've noticed is that it is possible to produce alternative markets, right? What you have is a collection of consumers who are prepared to pay more for a product that is not exploitative. In the good case, you have a certification scheme that has not somehow been captured by actors looking to manipulate it. And you have people who are producing the products under non-exploitative circumstances that are able to benefit from the fact that they are, we can think of this in terms of information exchange, like consumers are able to get information about which producers are exploitative and which ones aren't and make a choice. And in that kind of case, you can imagine a market sort of reaching an equilibrium where by buying the fair trade products, you are in fact promoting non-exploitative labor products, non-exploitative labor practices in the relevant domain. And so I think to the extent that those preconditions are met, right, there are such non-exploitative fair trade practices, there are reasonable information flows that can be reliable, et cetera. I think that Burge is exactly correct to think that this is a kind of model. Now, notice, of course, if it's perennially a kind of marginal model, if the idea is that like only like, 1/10 of 1% of chocolate consumers buy the fair trade chocolate, it's not as if you're going to sort of thereby rid the world of the injustice of the relevant kinds of labor exploitation. But you might think, oh, you are, again, think in terms of these models. You might be individually making a difference. Or at very least, you might be part of a group that is, as a group, bringing about this good effect, right? You wouldn't be doing the thing that you're encouraged to think about in the last model. You wouldn't be like transforming the structure such that the structure itself kind of ensures for a lack of exploitation. But you might think, you can't do everything. I am doing something meaningful that can be explained in terms of the first three models, at least. Like maybe I'm not being complicit, maybe I'm part of a group that's doing something, and maybe I'm individually making a difference. So yeah, that's a great question that I definitely didn't talk enough about during the talk.
So, okay, here's a very general question. What's the ethical upshot of this talk? You've given us 4 models of ethical explanation, but you've not claimed that one of them is correct. It's also not clear what I should do if I accept one of these models.
Yeah, so I agree entirely with this. And I, again, just kind of want to reiterate my goals in the talk. So one of the, I think, deep questions about what we're doing when we're doing ethics is like, are we trying to, as it were, get answers that are immediately practically serviceable? Or are we trying to better understand the ethical phenomena? And really what my goal has been today is to give you as members of the audience tools to better understand the underlying phenomena so that we all can work together to make progress on these questions. So I don't myself have a settled view about the best way to think about these explanatory questions. And as has come out in discussing a bunch of these questions in the Q&A, I think even if I was to settle on some of those views, there'd be these huge background questions in economics, et cetera, that we really need to get a better grip on in order to be able to conclude from some of these models what an individual person should do, right? And so my goal here today has been to really give people tools to think better about these topics, but not sort of to tell you, and so you should like not buy that can of Coke, or you should buy that can of Coke, right? That hasn't been the goal. And I think part of the reason why it hasn't been the goal is I think that's not a question where I'm sort of prepared to, as an expert, tell you here's how it is. Rather, I think what I can contribute as an expert is here are a bunch of tools to think for yourself about that question.
Great. So I think if we've got time, there are 2 questions that are actually sort of, as it were, focused on or sort of leading to opposite sorts of conclusions. So the first question is from an anonymous attendee, and it's really focusing on the question about the social structural explanations. So the question really at the end is whether or not the wrong of mistreatment of non-human animals isn't about structure, but about individuals acting immorally. But the case they're imagining to motivate that is, they're just taking it as an example, is the case of factory farming. And they're imagining they live in a society that taxes both meat production and consumption to a very high rate, but corporations and people just pay the tax. It seems the society is, at least in that regard, structurally just, but the wrong still seems to exist. So they're taking that to suggest that perhaps the wrong of mistreatment of non-human animals isn't about structure, but about individual acting immorally. So I guess they're looking for you to sort of to comment on that.
All right. So I take it one of the ways to think about this question, and I'll just say how I'm understanding it, is like this is a question that might be understood as sort of saying, like, even if you set up the structure just so, couldn't individuals just like bloody-mindedly, get together and bring about terrible outcomes, right? So I want to question how that's set up. So first of all, I want to say, like, it's certainly possible that individuals can get together and bloody-mindedly bring about terrible outcomes, right? I think I want to question whether we should take for granted in this situation that the relevant background is structurally just. I take it that the reason why the questioner is thinking that is that the questioner is thinking, here we have a background structure that, if people were reasonably responsive to these incentives, would produce outcomes that were structurally just, or would produce outcomes that were substantively just. Therefore, like, the structure is doing its role, right? But I guess I think one of the things I feel like I've learned from parts of my engagement with the literature on the psychology of rationality, for example, is that sometimes there are contexts and circumstances in which human beings are sort of systematically irrational. And I wouldn't want to say that if there's a kind of injustice that's in part centrally explained by a kind of causally robust, systematic kind of human irrationality, that, like, if our social structure just lets that injustice go because it's not explained by people rationally responding to their incentives, that the society gets the thumbs up. It seems to me, no. We need to, as it were, program for how people actually are. We need to have social structures that are responsive to people's psychologies. And if people's psychologies are such that they're going to be bloody-minded in these ways, we need to think about, like, what's the trade-off between, on the one hand, impinging on their freedom, and on the other hand, ensuring that when they exercise their freedom collectively, they don't bring about outcomes that are unjust or otherwise systematically wrongful for other persons.
Okay, thank you. That seems to me like a good place to stop. And thank you very much, Tristram, for the presentation, for responding to the questions.
All right. I also want to just say thank you to all the people who asked questions. I see there's several extra questions in the queue. I'll see if, like, maybe we can, like, take some sort of screenshot. Maybe Alex can take some sort of screenshot of these. And if I know who you are, if some of you I do, I'd be happy to have further conversations with you based on those questions, because they look fantastic.
Thank you.